As we wade into these waters of nonviolence and the 6 principles laid out by Dr. King, informed by Gandhi and Jesus, we must watch for the undercurrents that threaten to drown us, and for the fins that look like sharks but are actually just playful dolphins. We must wear life preservers to save ourselves, but be ready at any minute to share them with others whose lives are in real danger. The first principle of nonviolence taught us that we must be courageous because nonviolence requires our whole lives, since nonviolence is a way of life that permeates every aspect of our lives, and it's never just one choice in one moment. I told the Wednesday morning group that meets each week on Zoom, to which everyone is invited, that after I preached last Sunday, I made it through almost 12 hours before I had another violent thought. And the violent thought happened as I was driving on Monday morning, and internally letting every driver I encountered know they are jerks. One of the areas in which my own commitment to nonviolence is quickly eroded is when I drive. After calling everyone on the road a jerk in my head on Monday morning, I reminded myself that I'm trying to live nonviolently. So I asked myself the question, why am I so mad at all of these drivers? My honest answer was, I booked myself too tightly today, and that means I am rushing from one place to another, trying to get to the next place on time. I realized in that moment that my frustration was coming from something completely in my control, my schedule, and it really had nothing to do with the other drivers and everything to do with me. I took some deep breaths, reminded myself that every driver on the road has their own day to face, and I refrained from honking, thinking bad or mean thoughts, and I did it for the rest of the trip, despite how slowly some of them were driving. While it's partly funny and in the scope of nonviolence seems completely inconsequential, what I'm describing is exactly how nonviolence becomes a way of life. We notice, we ask ourselves honest and difficult questions, and then we course correct. In some ways, that seems easy to do in comparison to our next principle. The second principle of nonviolence states that nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding from our opponent rather than to work to defeat or humiliate them. If the overall goal of nonviolence is to create the beloved community, then we cannot destroy people in the process. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation because we all still have to live together. That means how we engage in resisting evil and violence is critically important as we imagine how to live together in the aftermath. This second principle is no joke. During one of the biggest fights I ever had with one of my sisters as adults, I said to her, "You and I are so different that if we weren't sisters, we probably wouldn't even be friends." She was mortally wounded by my comment, and I'm pretty sure to this day has still not forgiven me for it. She told me it was the worst thing I ever could have said to her, and showed how little I cared for her. No matter how many times I tried to explain that I was talking about our differences and the fact that we wouldn't naturally be attracted to each other if we weren't sisters, she simply couldn't hear it. All she could hear was that I would never choose her to be my friend. Friendship has always been very important to me, partly because of how troubled my family life was from early on. Before I even knew or had heard of the term chosen or found family, I lived it. I was taken in by many people older than me who thought of me as part of their families. I had friends who were closer to me than my biological family, and that was part of the heart of the issue with my sister. And I've always prioritized and cultivated and protected my friendships. Like so many of you, I have circles of friends. Some of my friends are activity, or at the time they were school-related. Some were instantly the lifelong kind. And some friendships have been necessitated by circumstances. In other words, friendship means different things depending on the context. This is important as we consider how to seek friendship and understanding with our opponents. When we think of seeking friendship and understanding with MAGA Republicans, and especially those who identify as evangelical Christians, or now who boldly identify as white Christian nationalists, the task seems utterly impossible. What could possibly attract us to someone like that? And what could possibly lead to friendship with them? It helps me to know that I am not seeking a new best friend or close confidant. Rather, I am seeking the kind of friendship that allows for conversation and some kind of exchange of information about who we are. Haven't you ever made a new friend on an airplane, or standing in a long line to get into a concert or a ball game? Haven't you ever made a new friend at the playground while your kids or grandkids were playing, or at the swimming pool? You might never see the person again, but for an instant, you thought of them as a new friend. One of my good friends in one of my many circles just told me a story about a reunion she went to in St. Louis, Missouri, with colleagues from one of her first workplaces after college. Someone was retiring, and they all decided to gather to celebrate and remember. Around the dinner table were less than a dozen people, and at least half were self-identified Republicans. She described how nervous she was as the conversation turned to politics. She is a Democrat. But she said something very rare happened in that dinner around the table. Each person listened to the other, wanting and trying to understand. She said it was the first time in years she has felt any hope. When I asked her why that conversation went so well when many conversations don't, she said she thinks there are two reasons. One is that while they don't keep in touch with each other, this group has a history of having basic respect for each other. The second is that they all have listening skills because of their areas of expertise. Most are organizational psychologists and consultants. And they decided to use those skills to better understand those around the table with whom they disagreed. I could see the hope and energy she felt even as she retold the story. She wasn't sure anyone changed their minds that night, but they all left with more understanding of perspectives that are not their own. This is at the heart of the second principle. Jesus talked about this in terms of loving our enemies because Jesus knew that if hatred and revenge and retaliation were allowed to foment, there would never be a beloved community sharing and caring for each other. Last week we talked about how one of Jesus' first public appearances after being in the wilderness was when Jesus was in the synagogue and read the scroll containing the Isaiah passage that said, "The Spirit of God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim release for the captives and liberation for prisoners." After Jesus explained what he would be doing, he then exhorted his followers, including us, with the words Ray read this morning. We're only looking at these two verses this morning because in so many ways they bear the same weight as entire books of the Bible. Jesus said, "But I say to you, willing to hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you." The verbs are to love, to do good, to bless, and to pray for. I did some study on each of these words, and sadly, I am here to report there is no wiggle room. I looked. We are to actively make sure we are not denigrating, mistreating, cursing, ignoring, or taking revenge on those who we consider to be our opponents or foes. We do not have to feel love for people we deem our enemies, but we are charged by Jesus to act in love toward them. Not to act like we're in love with them, but to do actions of love. Doing good, blessing, and praying for are the details to how we can do actions of love toward our enemies. This teaching by Jesus is, ironically or maybe providentially, the exact place where we differ from those who are following former President and now candidate Trump. Where Trump espouses any and all forms of violence in order to exert and maintain power, we follow Jesus, who says there is no circumstance in which we are not called to love our enemy. Let me say that the other way. There is no circumstance, so in all circumstances, we are called to love our enemy. We cannot shirk our call to do good to those who hate us, and to bless those who curse us, and to pray for those who mistreat us in any circumstance. Remember last week when we talked about how nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Loving our enemies takes courage and a commitment to nonviolence. One of the theologians and biblical scholars who has done a deep dive into Jesus' commitment to nonviolence, or what he calls Jesus' third way, is Dr. Walter Wink. Walter Wink wrote the series titled The Powers That Be, which many of us have read. And in the book with that same name, which is a kind of summary of all the books, he writes that one of the primary principles of nonviolent struggle is that the means must be consistent with the ends. That is the foundation for any kind of nonviolent struggle. The means must be consistent with the ends. Wink writes, in Jesus' third way, the means we employ must be commensurate with the new order we desire. The means used will determine the ends that are realized. Violent means are unlikely to produce peaceful ends. Because armed struggles rely on a coercive, hierarchical structure, they set into place patterns that are not easily renounced when victory is won. After assuming power, the victors tend to deal with ideological differences within the movement by the same methods used to gain power: exterminations, purges, torture, and mass arrests. We've seen that repeated so many times through history. Wink then highlights that nonviolent revolution is not a program for seizing power, but, as Gandhi showed the world, it's a program for transforming relationships, ending in a peaceful transfer of power. One of the most powerful examples of that in many of our lifetimes was South African Nelson Mandela, who, after 27 years of imprisonment, chose to unite all races to work together to heal that nation, rather than choosing bitterness and vindictiveness and revenge. The way of Jesus is not an easy way. When we talk about this second principle in which we seek friendship and understanding, friendship does not mean we literally must keep as close friends people who started out as enemies. It means instead that we are called to act as though our enemies are our friends. It means that to treat someone as an enemy is going against the image of God in us and in that other person or those people. There is some difference between a group of people and a specific person. Because of this season of conventions, it's easy to use the groupings of Republicans and Democrats because we're all thinking in those ways. So, just to be fair, let's use MAGA or Trump Republicans and progressive Democrats, since there are many folks who refuse to identify as either, who hang out in a kind of middle ground. We would be accurate in saying that the enemy of progressive Democrats are MAGA Republicans and vice versa. If we are choosing Jesus' third way, or the way of nonviolence, we would look for tangible ways to use integral thinking, which we talked about in June. Remember the idea of transcending and including? To include, we find any areas of shared value or even agreement, and we take those, and then we transcend all that is limiting, unhealthy, or false. By integrating valid insights from other perspectives, we've moved beyond our own, sometimes limited ways of thinking and understanding the world. I don't know about you, but I think it is far more difficult to find areas of agreement or shared values than it is to find differences. What my friend experienced as hope in her conversation with a group that was split between Democrats and Republicans is that they were able to identify and articulate their shared values. So much of this depends on who our enemies are. Are they family members? Are they people who live next door or above us? Are they church members? Are they complete strangers? Are they people who hold elected positions of power? Some of you know that the most difficult conversations can be with family members because of the shared history and roles and judgments. Our parents or siblings can be the most challenging ones to practice transcending and including, or to even find shared values. While we may not put them in the category of enemy, we find ourselves walking on eggshells with them, and many times just simply trying to avoid them, or at least avoid any kind of meaningful conversation. How are we supposed to seek friendship and understanding with the ones who can hurt us the most? And then how do we do it with people who are complete strangers? Last week, I confessed, and didn't surprise any of you, that I am not an expert on any of this. I have learned a few things along the way, and some of what I've learned and experienced have come from some of you over time. Some of it has come from others. Some of it is taking Jesus' words at face value. If you want to seek friendship and understanding with people who are your opponents, begin with what Jesus exhorts us to do. Love your enemies. You don't have to act like them. You don't have to want to hang out with them. It just requires acting in love toward them. Acting in love means doing good to them, blessing them, and praying for them. If it all seems too much, maybe the place to begin is simply by praying for them. One of the ways I have been able to do this over time is by using my imagination to picture a world in which that person, if it's an individual, or those people, if it's a group, can thrive and be well, and so much so that they never want to harm any other person or creature or even our planet. By working for that world, I imagine myself doing good to them and blessing them. So you can see it's not a direct thing. I don't have to see myself doing good directly to them, but I can do good in a way that contributes to their thriving and their well-being. Any person who has committed themselves to prayer over time will tell you that when you pray for someone or a group of people, you cannot hate them at the same time. Remember, over time, those two things cannot happen simultaneously. You cannot pray for a person or a group over time and hold on to hate for them. That's why simply praying for your enemies can be a good first step. We all have to live together in the aftermath of whatever is our struggle for justice, violent or nonviolent. When we talk about seeking friendship and understanding, we must be very clear on one point. We do not ever get to tell people who have been harmed or oppressed that they are responsible for befriending others or understanding others. We can invite, we can provide opportunities, we can preach and teach nonviolence, but we never get to impose this on someone who has been the victim of violence of any kind. Someone who has been abused gets to choose whether or not they want to seek to understand their abuser. In that case, we are talking about something altogether different. We, as a community, are talking about justice and politics and even religion when we look at Jesus' words to us. As is often the case, Jesus was speaking to the community. Individuals make up any community, which means we are individually and communally accountable. As individuals, we make commitments and choices. If I cram my schedule full and then get angry when it doesn't all work out, and if I take my anger out on you or anyone else, I am an individual creating all kinds of havoc based on decisions I am making. Jesus wanted his followers and all who heard his message to love their enemies, to do good to those who hated them, to bless those who cursed them, and to pray for those who mistreated them. How will we do these things individually and together? Next Sunday, the Reverend Dr. Janie Spar is going to be with us, and she and I are going to be in conversation about how this looks in real time when it comes to people and not destroying people in the midst of any kind of the seeking of justice. If it seems impossible to live in this nonviolent way, or even actually repulsive, I invite you to choose just one thing and begin to do that one thing in the coming week. Love, bless, do good, pray. Just choose one. And just so that you can make it real, I invite you to share that one thing with someone after church. With the courage we heard about last week, and with a desire to seek friendship and understanding, let us commit, even in the smallest of ways, to this second principle of nonviolence today. And then commit again tomorrow. And then commit again the day after. Amen.